In this lesson, we will learn about affricates. Ch, j. These sounds are a combination of a stop and a fricative, making one new sound. That's to say, the sound begins with a stop and ends with a fricative. Each of these two sounds consists of two elements. The first is a stop, t and d, and the second is a fricative, sh and j. The articulation of ch starts like that of t and ends like that of sh. Thus, ch is a voiceless affricate. It occurs initially as in cheese, chart, chapter, medially as in kitchen, fortune, and finally as in church, catch, stretch. As to j, it is a voiced affricate. The articulation of j starts like that of d and ends like that of zh. It occurs initially as in joke, joy, joint, medially as in rigid, agent, and finally as in edge, bridge, age. In this lesson, we will learn about back vowels. A, O, O, U, U. A occurs initially as in ask, art, medially as in heart, part, hard, and finally as in car, bar. O occurs initially as in on, offer, medially as in lost, song, yet it never occurs finally. O is longer than O. It occurs initially as in ought, or, medially as in fought, court, and finally as in law, saw. U never occurs initially, yet it occurs medially as in put, foot, book, and finally as in who, do. U occurs initially as in ooze, medially as in pool, fool, moon, and finally as in tattoo, chew, crew. In this lesson, we will learn about central vowels. A, A occurs initially as in utter, under, medially as in hug, cup, subtle, yet it never occurs finally. A is the commonest English vowel. It occurs initially as in about, above, medially as in bishop, murdered, and finally as in teacher, dancer, answer. Occurs initially as in earn, medially as in birth, bird, work, and finally as in fur, prefer. In this lesson, we will learn about diphthongs. Diphthong simply means the combination of two vowel sounds, where the tongue begins with the position of a certain vowel sound and ends at another. English contains 8 diphthongs. For example, when pronouncing A, the tongue begins with the same position of E, then it ends at E. For example, play, came, fate, hate, ate. Yet, when pronouncing I, the tongue begins with the same position for R, then it ends at E. For example, guy, thigh, sigh, sky, I, high. As to oi, the tongue begins with the same position for O, then it ends at E. For example, foil, annoy, soil, boy, oil. With respect to ow, the tongue goes from a to u. For example, how, cow, bow, vow. As to o, the tongue begins with a, then it ends with u. For example, go, so, low. With respect to ear, the tongue begins with e, then it ends with a. For example, fear, ear, seer, dear, mere. As to e, the tongue begins with e, then it ends with a. For example, fe, be, e, he, ke. With regard to ua, the tongue begins with u, and it ends with a. For example, mature, tour. In this lesson, we will learn about fricatives. Fa, va, tha, the, ha, s, z, sh, zh, r. Zh is the voiced counterpart of sh. It is not very common sound in English, as it occurs mainly in loan words, particularly French words. It never occurs initially, yet it occurs medially, as in measure, pleasure, leisure, and finally as in mirage, garage. Lateral fricative, Despite the fact that is a fricative, friction does not follow sound's production. When comes before a consonant, or when it comes finally, it is never pronounced in British English. As in car, bar, arm. Yet, if is followed by a vowel, it is pronounced as in the car is mine. Fa is a fricative. The vocal cords do not vibrate, so the sound is voiceless. It occurs initially as in fly, frog, for, medially as in lift, effort, and finally as in stuff, staff. Va is the voiced counterpart of fa. Unlike fa, the vocal cords vibrate, so the sound is voiced. It occurs initially as in visit, valley, vision, medially as in evil, elevator, and finally as in leave, save. Tha. When producing this sound, the vocal cords do not vibrate, so the sound is voiceless. It occurs initially as in thing, thin, thing, medially as in lethal, method, and finally as in myth, teeth, breath. The is the voiced counterpart of th. Unlike th, the vocal cords vibrate, so the sound is voiced. It occurs initially as in this, these, medially as in zither, brother, and finally as in breathe, read. Ha is a voiceless glottal fricative. During the pronunciation of ha, the tongue and lips are in the position for the pronunciation of the vowel sound that follows it. It occurs initially as in hate, hem, hat, medially as in fathead, and it never occurs finally. S is a hissing sound, which occurs in all word positions. Initially as in sad, see, sound, medially as in assign, assassinate, astonish, and finally as in sense, science. Z is the voiced counterpart of s. It occurs initially as in zest, zoo, medially as in reside, result, and finally as in size, nose, raise. Sh is a voiceless faultless fricative. It occurs initially as in ship, she, medially as in mission, ocean, and finally as in push, fish. In this lesson, we will learn about front vowels. E, a, a. E comes initially as in eat, equal, Easter, medially as in dean, bean, keen, and finally as in C, B. A comes initially as in N, it, medially as in myth, lyrics, sing, and finally as in friendly, pretty. A. It occurs initially as in egg, medially as in berry, head, said, yet it never occurs finally. A comes initially as in and, act, medially as in hat, bag, rabbit, sad, but it never comes finally.